Pleasure to first introduce James Jones, who's coming back to us. He's now an assistant professor at Rutgers and has done a lot of work on the history of this department and race. And so I asked James to provide our introduction. So James, welcome home.
Thank you. So you guys can't get rid of me. But no, it's really great to be back. I was really excited that Bruce is coming here to talk about his family. When I was here and I was a graduate student, I was really curious about my roots, right? Not necessarily in this sort of typical ancestral way, but like my intellectual ancestry, right? Who are my forebears here in this department? And so I started doing research early on about my predecessors, right? And I discovered this really rich, amazing history of African-American scholars who graduated from this department. Going back 10 years ago, we can look at people like Prudence Carter, who is now the Dean of the Graduate School at Berkeley, Graduate School of Education at Berkeley. But even going back to the origins of this department, you would see this amazing history of Black scholars graduating from here, right? We could think about the work of Ira Augustine Reed, who graduated with his PhD in 1939 from the department. He wrote 10 books before he even got his, or 9 books between 1928 and 1939 before he got his PhD here, right? His 10th book, which is on the Negro immigrant, is a classic book that's still taught today. He was an officer at ASA and ESS. He was an assistant editor of ASR. He was the first African American to get a tenure position at Harvard College. We can go back even in the 1920s to 1923 and look at the work of Elizabeth Ross Haynes, right? Bruce's grandmother, who was, I'm not sure if she's the first African American to graduate with a master's, but probably
definitely among the first.
Yes, right? In 1923, she wrote an important thesis on Black domestic workers. Then also Bruce's grandfather, right? George Edmund Haynes, who is a founder and first executive director of the National Urban League, who earned his PhD in the department and the first of the university. And so it's really an honor to have Bruce here to sort of talk about his family's legacy. Bruce is an assistant professor at UC Davis. I'm sorry, a professor. I'm sorry, full professor. See, like this would happen. So my assistant professor. Yeah. He's the author of 3 books. Red Lines and Black Space. Excuse me, the Ghetto, and now his 3rd book, Down the Staircase.
It's hard. I've said it wrong, so don't worry. It's easy to
Down the Up Staircase. There it is, with his co-author Syma Solovitch. So we are glad to have you here.
Thank you. James, thanks for that great introduction and a little history of the department. It's really exciting to be here with my co-author. In some ways, it's kind of maybe one of the most symbolic talks I've ever given in my career, because it's a return of my grandfather through me to this space. I probably never would have written this book had I not been the grandson of George Edmund Haynes. And it so happened that my instinct as a child was to collect everything. And so I became kind of a family historian and repository, so to speak. And at my parents' age, they gave stuff to me, and I dragged it all over the country in boxes to Yonkers, to California, where I still have boxes in my garage of things from George Edmund Haynes' life. And I always, when I was in college, I really discovered that he was a sociologist, because I grew up knowing he was an educator. That's all Dad said. And I knew he wrote books, and an educator, a Black educator. And so I'm in college, a sociology major up at Manhattan College, and I discovered he's a sociologist and doing urban. And I thought, wow, that's cool, because I am interested in urban, and I'm interested in race, and how odd, because I never met this relative of mine. And in fact, he died 9 months before I was born. So he died in January of 1960, and I'm born in November of 1960. So there's this strange connection I feel I've always had with this person who I've never met. So you jump ahead a few years, and I've been teaching for quite some time. And I came out in '95 with my degree, and I thought, wow, I'm getting older, and I'm starting to lose my memory already. And I guess if I'm going to write a book, I better do it soon, because this stuff is going to end up in the garbage when I die, and people come to throw it away, right? And I have historical documents that should be in a museum somewhere. And I thought, wow, who has this to draw on to write? And then there were the sort of sociological reasons for writing. And first of all, there's Michael Booroy's plea to us to reach broader audiences, right? To get out of our silos, and as he said, to reach multiple audiences. And I thought I would do that with an ethnography, and nobody reads my red lines. It sits up on the shelf. It's a nice academic book. My friends don't get through 2 pages of it. And I always wanted to write something that was going to cross into those audiences. And then I've been teaching sociology for a number of years, and any of you who teach intro, I love teaching intro, and we're always talking about the sociological imagination. I mean, it's sort of like a trope for us, right? And connect biography to history and structure and context, but how many of us actually write that way? And I thought, why is it that everyone in other disciplines can write about race? Journalists write about race, historians write about race. Yet our discipline had constrained me and said, you can't really do this because that's not data. So I thought to myself, how can I take this social history that I have, take this legacy that I have, and try to reach a broader audience, and also tell a story about race and mobility, because people look at me as a full professor and say, oh, this is working great. You made it out of the hood, didn't you? Your parents are proud of you, aren't you? And I'm thinking, no, I'm studying it. Look at the inequality, and you're not seeing the reality through me. In fact, I end up confirming people's presumption that everything is fine. And so it's to those people who I wanted to focus this book, the very liberal, Berkeley folk and people who are in my college town of Davis, who think they understand race, who think they understand what it means to be a person of color in America. And I felt I have this life despite the racial obstacles I've had, and despite the other obstacles of life and class that I've had. So that was another major reason for wanting to write this book. And then again, everything's context. And so I happen to have been married to someone who brought amazing literary skills to the table. And I knew we needed a story, we needed emotion, we needed the very things that we actually do a lot of effort to keep out of our writing. I needed that in the writing, because otherwise no one wanted to follow the story, and I couldn't get them to think about the race stuff because they didn't care about the character. And so I'm going to turn it over now to my co-author, because this is why literature, we use literature as a vehicle to write a kind of sociological history. They call it a memoir. I did not set out to write a memoir. I set out to be a fly on the wall. I was going to tell you about this great history, but everybody kept saying, well, great, this happened, but where are you? What did you think? What did you do? What happened? And so increasingly, my voice became a sort of the stronger voice, or at least a balancing voice, to the voice that I really wanted in there, which was the flow of historical forces and context out of which people make choices.
So one of the things that interested me in this book, and Chris came with basically these ideas about capturing these broad sociological forces that impinge on the lives of his family. And what I felt was that in order for the reader to really care about these forces and to actually learn about, how these constraints shape their lives, you have to first really be drawn to the characters themselves. And I knew Bruce's parents and brother, and felt that they were really fascinating, memorable characters. Part of the tension between the two of us, I really wanted to capture these messy, complex, extraordinary, memorable characters, which required taking a lot of risks that were kind of counter to his training, and also
We like to qualify everything.
like,
I'm saying this, but it could be that.
it could be this. And so making bold, unequivocal statements, taking risks, connecting with raw emotions, exposing messy stuff in his family, exposing things about his own life. That was the only way that people would really want to take that journey. And along the way, learn about these sociological forces that impinge on their lives, but not reducing them to byproducts of these forces, to really give them their full humanity. And so race doesn't explain everything, but it's one other dimension which makes the story much more interesting. I mean, there's so many memoirs out there that people love, and about all of these crazy dysfunctional families. So this is one of them. And then on top of that, you've got this dimension of race, which makes it so much more complex and interesting, and teaches us something that we don't usually get from most memoirs. We are going to read a few selections, and we can take questions along the way. We have two passages that we wanted to start with. One is the preface, which gives some background, and then we'll jump into the middle of the book.
Before we go there, it's one of the things I failed to say, and I have to say this. George Edmund Haynes got his PhD here at Columbia in 1912, the first African American to get a PhD. But when he graduated Fisk with his wife Elizabeth during the same year, the president of Fisk said that Elizabeth was the smarter of the two. And that always stuck with me, because race prevented him from, say, teaching at the school that he attended, but gender prevented Elizabeth from getting the PhD. And in fact, she's a contemporary of Anna Julia Cooper, who ended up getting her PhD just 2 years later at the Sorbonne. And so I thought, wow, she could have beat Anna Julia had she had a different, access to what she had to do, what they call correspondence classes at the University of Chicago to get her master's. That's how she got her master's. She couldn't even attend class. And so her voice, and in writing this book, the thing that hit me most was Elizabeth is in the shadows of George Edmund Haynes throughout her entire career. She writes the first study of black domestic workers in 1920, working for the State Department, Department of Labor. She writes the first children's book for an African American that gets published by Du Bois. She runs for elected office in Harlem under the Republican Party in the 1930s. And yet, her legacy is reduced to the fact that, well, she served in the YMCA and she was a good social worker. And so I didn't want this day to pass without bringing up what I feel is one of the most sociological things that is it's embedded in this context, but so many people won't see it. I could have written this book, and every publisher would have been very happy for me to be the author and for my wife to be completely invisible in this context. And I have to say, she is the writer. I am still learning the craft, but she is the one who understood the literary themes that we had to pull out. She was the one who understood that the house had to be a character. And that by drawing from the family to the house, to Harlem, to New York, that we could begin to do these layers and draw a thick description of a social reality. And I guess I did not want this day to go by without us understanding that the invisibility that still exists with my second author as we've gone around and presented, and the attention comes to me as the grandson, and everybody wants to know, oh, this is great, and my author remains invisible. And I think this is somehow such a great, deep sociological irony. And I felt, okay, and she's mad that I'm saying this. And I'll take the heat for it later, because I think it's important, and it's something that I felt deeply about in telling this story about Elizabeth, that Elizabeth's story was not lost, and that she did not remain in the shadows of George Haynes, and that she was elevated to the same level of scholar that we now elevate George Haynes to. So, that, he said. In November 1995, my parents hired a chauffeur and limousine to take them from Sugar Hill, Harlem, to the quaint seashore town of Milford, Connecticut, where my future had finally begun. I had defended my doctoral dissertation that May, married in July, and moved to Connecticut in September to begin teaching at Yale. The limo ride was a once-in-a-lifetime event for my dad, a man who counted kilowatts and pennies and stashed slivers of soap to be used later for bubble bath. But he was old now and frail, and a final nod to my mother as well as to his own mortality. He spared no expense for this Thanksgiving Day. We had long since stopped celebrating holidays at our family home, which had no running water on the main floor. By 1995, my parents were living like squatters in their own home. The pipes were frozen and busted, the roof was beyond repair, and despite the size of the house, nearly 5,000 square feet, space was at a premium. Nothing had been dusted, cleared, discarded, or repaired in more than 2 decades. What was once a former parlor that hosted W.E.B. Du Bois and other talented 10th elites now held the remnants of my brother George's failed business ventures. Half-empty cans of spray paint, battered furniture, and broken appliances heaped on top of one another. One might have taken the scene for the final stages of a family move, all stacked up and ready to go, except there was a frozenness about it, a sense of havoc in suspension. My parents had money and could easily have fixed the place if they had chosen to. Pop was collecting a modest monthly pension from the New York State Division of Parole and was sitting on some sweet blue chip stocks he'd bought on margin back in the 1970s. Mom was still employed. She was Director of Quality Insurance at the Washington Heights West Inwood Community Mental Health Center. But caught in a whirl of reprisal and censure, my parents had let the house fall to ruin until they were living in near squalor.
That Thanksgiving morning, my mother would have sponge bathed with Poland spring water before unwrapping her silk blouse and Dior suit from their plastic encasements, taking care to keep them from brushing against the dust-thick armoire. She would have fixed her makeup in a dirty, cracked mirror in a lightless room before carving a path through the stacks of old newspapers and empty water bottles that littered the floor. My father and her mink coat would be waiting for her on the first floor landing. After locking the double doors, a barricade of latches, padlocks, and deadbolts, my parents would have climbed into the back of the sleek limousine and instructed the driver to circle around to pick up my brother George, who was now living in a halfway house just a few blocks away. Then up Riverside Drive and the Henry Hudson Parkway and on to the world that my mother had always imagined for me. They arrived in full fanfare. My mother's arms were laden with the customary bags from Zabar's, Citrella's, and Greenberg's Bakery. George, that's Bruce's brother, followed dutifully with what seemed like a year's supply of toilet paper. Pop, haggard and unsteady, carried a long rectangular frame. In it was an oil painting of my grandfather, George Edmund Haynes. On its upper right corner was the signature of Laura Wheeler Waring, a prominent Negro portraitist of the Harlem Renaissance. As I came to learn later, the painting was one of 23 portraits of outstanding Americans of Negro origin that had appeared at the Smithsonian Institution in 1944 and that toured the country between 1944 and 1946. In the 1960s, most of the portraits were donated to the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian, where they remain to this day. The portrait of George Haynes, long buried in our attic, was one of the few that had gone missing. The painting brought up so many questions. How did Pop come to own it? Why had he never spoken of it? Why was it consigned to the attic? There would never be enough time to get the answers to these questions. Pop died within a month of the visit. The discovery of the portrait renewed my feelings of ancestral pride, but also dredged up memories of pain and dysfunction in my family's history. My dad's conflicted feelings towards his own father, his betrayal of my mother, the ruthless neglect of our home, the murder of one son, the addiction and mental illness of another, the countless wounds and indignities and heartbreaks that my parents had endured. And it underscored the tenuous nature of existence for Black middle-class families like my own. How much protection did the gains of my forefathers, the safety net of a stable two-parent household, and the advantages of expensive private schools ultimately give my brothers and me against becoming 3 more Black male statistics?
In 1967, the sociologists Peter Blau and Otis Duncan conducted their now classic study examining the relationship between parental background and children's occupational outcomes. They found that among white families, a parent's education and class were strong predictors of their children's occupational attainment. In Black families, however, the children were more likely to end up in the lower strata of the economy, regardless of their parents' backgrounds. In many ways, my family defied the odds. All 4 great-grandparents on my father's side owned land in the South as early as 1880. My grandfather was the first Black social economist in the country. His wife, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, was an important children's author of the Harlem Renaissance and an esteemed social scientist of the day. And while my mother's side did not come from money, 3 successive generations of women in her family were college educated. My parents had master's degrees and were gainfully employed. My brothers and I all attended elite private schools, and I had just completed my PhD and was teaching at Yale University. We owned a 3-story brownstone in Harlem, the kind built for a rising moneyed class. Now, it stood as testament to our family's rise and demise over the century. Its walls echo the voices of 3 generations of a Black middle-class family. The hard-won glories of my grandfather, the whispered regrets and concessions of my parents, the fall from grace of their firstborn, and the wrenching blow that came with the death of their second.
Yet as our home and family tumbled, my mother held her head high and showed the world a triumphant Negro who wore her wealth and success on her sleeve. She wore designer suits and dazzling diamonds and kept a standing Saturday appointment at Saks Fifth Avenue to get her fingernails and toenails polished, classic red. No one, not even her closest friends, would know that she hauled jugs of water up the stairs each night to sponge bathe, cook, and flush the toilet. Unable to receive guests in her own house, she entertained in trendy restaurants, often throwing lavish dinner parties for up to 30 people at Empire Szechuan on the Upper West Side. To see her, this dark-skinned beauty with her flawless skin well into her 70s, snapping her fingers at waiters, ordering General Tso's, which she pronounced Genito, chicken, like she owned the place. No one would guess what she came home to, nor would they have been allowed in if they'd asked. It was rare that anyone, neither my mother's friends nor my own, not my wife's family, not even the New York City Fire Department, much to their own frustration, would make their way past the double glass doors of 411 Convent Avenue.
Okay, so now we're going to read another section.
Is there, I don't know if anyone wanted to ask any questions before we move on, or just keep doing it?
I want you to keep reading.
Okay. So we're going to now jump to chapter 4. It's a chapter entitled Soul Dollars, and it takes place in the 1960s when Bruce is a little boy.
Late 60s, early 70s.
That's right. And so while much of the story takes place in Harlem Heights, this takes place in the Valley, 125th Street, and it focuses on, much of it focuses on the economy of Harlem and some of the deep contradictions of Harlem economics. Harlem beauty parlors served as a hub for a thriving underground economy. Numbers runners made their rounds to the policy racket, the poor man's lottery, taking down bets that stood to make a 6-to-1 return. Street hustlers stopped by regularly, selling their wares, anything from designer dresses and handbags to steaks and shoes, all to be had for a song. Some parlors allowed hustlers to temporarily set up shop in the corner. More frequently, they worked the room. Each hustler had his own style. Some would walk halfway down the aisle, drop their bags to the floor, and deliver their pitch. Others took a more personal approach, removing just a few sample items from supersized shopping bags and zigzagging the room while engaging in friendly banter. The meat man traveled by car and brought in boxes of prepackaged, unlabeled steaks. Striding through the shop, a few steaks balanced carefully on his arm, he'd search out the crowd for the least sign of interest and then pass his arm under a prospect's nose. Daisy often came home with a new hairdo and a stack of filet mignons, setting off yet another argument with Pop, Mr. Law Enforcement. Taking paper clips from the office was stealing in his book. Buying filet mignon off the back of a truck at the beauty parlor was too much for him to bear. Raymond's beauty shop drew a wide assortment of colorful characters, starting with Raymond, its owner. Before the word disco became popularized, or Patti LaBelle put on a gold and silver lame spacesuit, Raymond would dazzle the denizens in his nighttime attire. In the photographs he hung up or passed around at his shop, he looked as much the diva as Patti ever did, dressed in 3-inch platform shoes, silver lame cape, and thick makeup. But Disco Raymond only came out at night. By day, he played the role of a Harlem ladies' man. His nails were manicured and he wore Italian shoes and hip-hugging dress slacks under his apron. He had strong looks, trim sideburns, and an athletic build. He was charismatic, could carry a tune, and drew the attentions of men and women alike.
The guy who cut my hair, Joe, was a hulk of a man who might have passed for a halfback if it had not been for his demonstrative gestures and feminine lilt. It was a bit unsettling to be preened and fussed over by Joe as he exchanged catty gossip with the female staff. How Delilah wasn't fooling anyone with those extensions, or so-and-so had no business wearing hot pants. I enjoyed the touch of his hands as he massaged my scalp and stroked my head, and I wondered whether that made me a sissy. Pop was intolerant of anything deemed sissy. You'll be a sissy if you put that polish on your nails, he warned me. What did I know about these boundaries between men and women? I saw hipsters and hustlers at the beauty parlor having their nails trimmed and buffed right beside me. They didn't seem to be sissies. I thought a clear coat made me look like Superfly, and Mom didn't mind lending me her polish. Gender benders were part of the Harlem landscape of my childhood. One woman who frequented Raymond's smoked a stogie and wore a man's suit and tie. No one gave her a second look. In this space, where men performed like women, she stood out and blended in all at once. Another neighborhood character, Chris, ran a corner newsstand at 148th and St. Nicholas. Chris was a woman stuck in a man's body. She wore dresses and heels. Her hair was long and always seemed to be at various stages of losing its perm. As a child, I was struck by the combination of perfect cleavage and 5 o'clock shadow that often seeped through her heavy makeup. The idea that black gay men were stuck in the closet like their counterparts downtown does not fully capture the picture of 1960s Harlem, where drag queens found outlets as female impersonators on stage at the Apollo. Pimps dressed in mink and rabbit. Womanizers were so meticulous in their grooming and preoccupied with their image that they were indistinguishable from gay men, and charisma and flamboyance went hand in hand. Everybody knew somebody in their church who was a little too effeminate, who might cause them to wonder if brother so-and-so swings that way. But in a community that was desperate for resources, men who had talent and energy and know-how were not easily dismissed. Harlem was full of contradictions for anyone who dared to look. Mamie Canty, my mother's seamstress, was also a full-time bookie for Harlem kingpin Nicky Barnes, one of the biggest drug dealers in the city. I often accompanied my mother to Mamie's house down on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard near Central Park North to have a dress altered or to shop for designer dresses, suits, and colognes, which Mamie always seemed to come by mysteriously and to part with at outrageously low prices. Tall, thin, and dark-skinned, she had a droopy eye, likely the result of a stroke. She was also a bit wobbly on her feet, as if suffering from a long-time ailment. But she exuded style and sophistication. I usually waited in her bedroom with its king-size bed and large TV console always on and muted, while my mother and Mamie talked business in the living room. Sometimes a rack of clothes, uncannily similar to the ones in the downtown department stores, stretched across her bed. Jazz from the 1940s, Cab Calloway, Mildred Bailey, Charlie Parker played in the background. Everything Mamie owned, clothing, furnishings, art, was select and expensive. Once, she sold us a 6-foot marble table, a one-of-a-kind piece that even back then must have been valued at several $1,000s. In Harlem, where every barber or beauty salon accommodated a piece of the underground economy, Mamie's high-end offerings didn't seem unusual. Years later, Daisy would be stunned to read in the local papers that Mamie had been arrested for drug trafficking. The ring, headquartered at her house, controlled the heroin south of 111th and 112th Street between Lenox and 8th Avenues. By then, Mamie's beautiful marble table had long since lost its sheen. Water spots and rust stains had accumulated from the tin pans and water glasses that my father had deployed over the years to improvise a home humidifier system.
Sorry about that.
Technology takes over.
Okay. Nope. In Harlem, if it wasn't off the books, it was likely overpriced. Residents, regardless of class, were overcharged and underserved for the most basic of necessities. For years, the major supermarket chains steered clear of black neighborhoods, and the locally owned shops offered neither variety nor quality. Most folks in our neighborhood shopped at the Food Family at 147th and St. Nicholas Avenue, which was owned by two short, balding, well-fed brothers. They were ethnic in that inimitable way that only a New York shopkeeper can be. Tough-talking, street-savvy, nobody's fool ethnic. They wore big gold watches and thick gold chains with a large dangling cross prominently displayed, along with their chest hairs. With their sleeves rolled up and their shirts buttoned down, a cigar hanging out the side of the mouth, they exuded split-second savvy. They watched the customers like hawks, never sure who was there to buy and who was there to steal. And they would chase a teenager down the block over a package of hamburger meat. But they could be friendly and charming, especially with Daisy, with Bruce's mother, who always got a deal. The problem was that, as in many food stores in Harlem, the meat was owed and injected with water for added weight. The milk spoiled within a few days of purchase. The scales were loaded and the prices were inflated. I think we're gonna maybe stop here for a little bit and answer questions and
No, let's open it up for
the
discussion.
conversation go.
Peter.
So, I mean, it's very beautiful, and
Thanks.
I've also had the pleasure of reading it, but I'm curious about your thoughts about how you're mixing memory with this other voice. So I could imagine the memory of hairy guys with a big cross, and yet there are elements that strike me as hard to imagine someone 10, 8 years old.
I'm lucky I think it's the way my memory works, I guess. That I have I think of things visually. Actually, statistics was very hard for me until I started visualizing statistics in a spatial way. And so I think it's the way some of my emotional memories are, that I remembered things, and then the internet was amazing what we could do with going back to look up things. And so I could go back and confirm a lot of my memories with reality. And then I could also juxtapose my memories with my brother's memories. And so my brother, who as an adult had mental illness, in and out of city and state hospitals, now lives in Boston on SSI, and he agreed to allow us to interview him over a 2-year period.
10 years Bruce's senior.
Right. And that's what allows us to have a different view of Harlem, particularly in the hustling side of Harlem, because he went into it. And I actually was able to speak to some of his friends who he had back then and confirm his stories, and then confirm his stories with my view. So there was this kind of back and forth between the objective history and our memories, to get timelines correct, to make sure, was that 75 he got divorced, or was it 72 he got divorced? Because memories become very flaky. But it was amazing how much we could actually confirm. Like, I remembered things like, the television set I got, and you would know exactly, and then you could go back and find a set in the newspapers. Oh, there it is, that's the one that we bought. And so then you could get a name, and you could now pull that back into history. So it was kind of fun, but very difficult, because I was constantly living back in that history in order to access it. I had to really kind of place myself psychologically back there.
Can I just follow, because you're not from New York, correct?
I went to college here, and I taught here, and I have.
Oh.
She's
So
a
there's
Barnard
also
girl.
a sense of lived experience as you were writing.
And I taught in Central Harlem, so, you know, there were a lot of course it was in the 90s, but much of, you know, obviously this goes into the 80s and 90s, and I was 70s in New York going to college, so it certainly wasn't at all unfamiliar.
Really remarkable and such a pleasure to listen to you read.
Oh, thank
So
you.
my question is concerning neighborhood change. Just Harlem has undergone this tremendous change, and so how do you deal with gentrification, not just residential gentrification and the dynamics within the Black community, but also commercial gentrification and Harlem becoming the site of work?
Well, I would say we talk about it because it's beginning even in the 80s and 70s. So the process, you know, the 70s you really see the decline taking place, and you see the underground economy growing, and you see property values declining and inflation going up, and then suddenly somewhere in the mid 80s things start to turn around and buildings start going co-op, and people start thinking about investments. In some neighborhoods, like down in Manhattanville, where there are some nice brownstones, like, you know, 110th by Central Park West, people start buying down there, but they're not coming up to Harlem just yet. But eventually, all of that moves further up, and Annie Beveridge wrote a piece. I think there are 5,000 white folks who live in Central Harlem right now. And so the lucky thing for New York City, unlike many other cities, is that New York kept its public housing. So a lot of poor people in Harlem won't go anywhere because there's public housing. But a lot of other cities destroy their public housing, and that basically makes the way for a deeper level of gentrification. So Harlem's seen some gentrification, and even black gentrification. The person who bought my house was Fab Five Freddy. And Fab Five had the money to gut the house and, you know, from the foundation up, and put the high-tech infrastructure in and do all of those kinds of things. And he lucked out because he moved in right before property values went up. So I sold my house for a fraction of what they're worth today, but I got double what everybody else got at the time period, right? So, because I knew the house was worth something, but you could only go but so high back in that market in 1998. Had I waited till 2002, I might retire now. Timing is everything. Yes?
So I have a question about the story that, remember you were just talking about in terms of stores and like the storekeepers, and what you said was their sense that, you know, some of the people in the store are customers, some of the people are thieves.
They're
the ones that are in some sense the ones that are enforcing, they're providing the enforcement. That is, they're the ones that try to keep the rate of theft low, and they're the ones that are chasing the kids. And I'm just thinking with this in the context of what Rob Stevenson's notion of collective efficacy. And
I see
I'm
this.
just wondering if, when you were there, was it the sense that, you know, that the collective efficacy controlling crime was actually the shopkeepers, as opposed to something, you know, there's always the police somewhere, right? But aside from the police and the shopkeepers, the sense of what?
You know, they had a booth that was kind of central in the stores. This was before you had all the fancy mirrors where you could see all down the aisles. And their booth allowed them to look over the entire store. And they used to hang out up in their booth. And like I say, well, that's why I meant watching like hawks, because they actually had like a space where they could look down over. And because I remember talking up to the guys looking down with their bald heads, and and my mother, who had great emotional intelligence, she always met the owner wherever, whether it was the downtown stores or the uptown stores. She would meet the owner, and next thing she was friends, and they're giving her pounds of corned beef. Daisy, we just cooked this, try this, see what you like, and she'd bring it home, and so she had that way with people. But as far as the efficacy, no, I think this was just them protecting their own property. This was the days where teenagers used to go to the stores, and the stores had railings to keep the carts in, and the kids would hang out on the side of the railings and bag for people, and it was a hustle. You kind of just start begging for a lady and hope that she'd say, okay, walk me home, and then you make 50 cents or 30, whatever it was back in the day. And that was like one of the hustles, just like shoveling snow during the winter. Yes.
I love the book. Congratulations. There's so much in it. And
Thanks,
I
man.
enjoyed. I remember reading it in one sitting.
Thank you.
The intimate portrait of family, the fragility of the black middle class, the decline and downward mobility across generations, the politics of respectability and the mother engaging throughout her life.
Indeed.
So much there, and it's really deeply sensitive. I
Thank
have
you.
two questions for you. The first one has to do with the clear sense of downward mobility to loss in the family, especially with mother, which is a very poignant episode to read about. I kept thinking, how much of that is unique to your family, and how much of that is a larger story of the black middle class in Harlem in 1970? And my second question has to do with the heterogeneity within your family. Three brothers and how everyone ends up rather different, including your own story. Horizontal, upward mobility also. So how do you make sense of that heterogeneity? What explains to you the fact that you made it, why should your brothers struggle to make it in your own way?
Great questions. Let me start with the last question first. I think we grew up in different eras, even though we were so close in age. So my oldest brother was born in 1950, middle brother in 1953, and I was like the surprise baby in 1960. Because my parents, got married after the war, finished graduate school, started their family, had their babies, and a few years later, my mom at 38 or 9 had me, and that was unheard of in 1960. So I was a surprise. And as a result, my brothers, I think, had a much harsher experience with race growing up. They were the first generation that got integrated into private schools. Alan went to New Lincoln, Walden. George was at Horace Mann. He told of racial incidents at school, the kinds of things that I never experienced. He was tripped running around the football field because he played football and broke his ankle as a result. He was pushed down the stairs by kids. So George came out radicalized when he left high school, thinking about the 60s. Alan went the other way. He was the, I describe him kind of like the Afro hippie. He played, he was rock guitarist, smoked weed, had all his hippie friends. They'd be playing rock in the basement, and they had this crazy setup. I don't know if I talked about this, but they had this crazy setup where they wired the top of the door. So underneath the staircase, he and his buddies would smoke their weed, and so there was a closet that was under the staircase. They could keep all the smell in this little place, which was a practice room. And then they wired the door, so when my dad opened the door to the basement, a little light went on, and everybody had scrambled out of the thing. And so that was the other brother, very different, and he was, he had white friends and kind of, listened to Jimi Hendrix and Procol Harum, whereas George is listening to Miles and Coltrane, and they're like going in different directions. So I grew up influenced by both of their worlds. So of course I like Miles and Coltrane, and I listen to Led Zeppelin, and so I was influenced by culturally both of their worlds. And in the 70s, I think things had loosened up with regards to race. So I went to the Emerson School. We had a black principal at Emerson. She had worked at the Children's Television Workshop. It was a very integrated school. My teachers treated me nicely. We were across the street from Manhattan Country Day School, which also was a rather integrated school at that time. Those were very, very unique, progressive schools from New York during that period. And we had a black gym teacher who was gay and was a dancer. Okay, Tommy Hawkins. He was part of the Tommy Hawkins dance troupe, and this guy could not bounce a basketball worth beans. And so that was totally unusual to have that person. You know, I look back, I'm like, wow, you know, we had, in 5th grade, we did a dance performance for Christmas show. You know, I had a woman, girl standing on my knee doing a pirouette. And so we got exposed to very kind of high culture in sort of liberal Yorkville. You know, it's very not the typical experience of a middle-class black kid. So I actually grew up thinking that white people were New York Jews, which is obviously not the case. But leave the bubble of Manhattan, right? So literally, I did not hear certain things in school. I was called nigger once, and the kid who did it, I'm still on Facebook with him. I won't add him, but everybody was on him. Like, you know, I didn't have to do anything. All the other kids were on him, and I never heard again. And so there was a certain context that I grew up in that I realized was a pretty liberal, progressive bubble that, in fact, in the town of Davis now, I think my life was far more integrated than anything I see today.
Yes.
I have a question about the writing.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
And so, you know, you're speaking to a bunch of sociology faculty, graduate students, and we don't, I mean, the book is beautiful. We typically don't write like this. And I'm curious if you could give us, like, if you could say, like, I don't know, 3 lessons, 5 lessons, 1 lesson, 10 lessons for sociologists to improve their writing. Like, what would they be? Or like, what, you know, what, I mean, or another way of asking this is like, having worked with sociologists and knowing our kind of quirks and tics and patterns, you know, what are some things that you would recommend to us to do so that we could be closer to the kinds of texts that you produce than the kinds of texts that we produce? I'm sorry?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, besides get married, we can't.
I think that, I don't know, I mean, after, you know, having been married to Bruce for many years and reading not just his work, but, you know, being exposed to other work, I mean, there's certain words that I just hate that turn me off right away.
Mm-hmm.
Modernity. You know, deconstruct, I think, I don't know. I mean, and I know this is, I don't,
Discursive.
discursive. I mean, even, yeah, that's my favorite. But, I mean, just even in terms of, you know, like how Bruce even described the book, I would describe, I think we had very different experiences. You know, Bruce talks about, you know, even in terms of kind of the side that I brought to this, or that I pushed for, you know, he described as, you know, agency. And I would use that word. You know, I'm someone that just likes to read a lot of literature, and I don't think of, you know, some of my favorite characters having agency. I just, you know. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that, I think that, you know, there's wonderful, wonderful nonfiction books and articles that, you know, cover the same, you know, very much the same territory. You know, I love the Atlantic. I mean, I think kind of, I always pronounce his name out. You know, he certainly brings a real life and urgency to telling, you know, these some. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, in sociology, you've got certain buttons that you've got to, you know. I think there's no one formula, because I think it would be bad writing to but maybe just take a breath. I guess that's the image that comes to mind.
I would add to that, like every time we use like some of the words that she mentioned, unpack them and give better words, but don't give these kind of words that kind of have no grounding. You know, like, what is discursive? Like, we don't really, you know, it's kind of
I don't know. I mean, I sometimes, like when I edit Bruce's work, sometimes. And what I find and I don't want to put you on a, but I think that you've got a lot of, and I don't know if this is something that is, you know, typical sociologists or academics, but there's so many different, there's a lot of layering, and a lot of words that I'm not quite sure what they mean and what they're supposed to mean. And I think sometimes I'll say, well, take this word away and take this word away and take what's your point? And sometimes it's not a very strong point. But you wouldn't know it because there's all this stuff on top and it looks really smart. I don't understand it. And is it because I don't know this stuff, or is there something there? And so I constantly challenge him. I strip it, which he hates. I strip the sentence, and sometimes what's left, he has to admit, this is good.
It wasn't such a big idea after all.
So I guess I would advise, so that's a good point. What would I advise? I would advise stripping your sentences down to yourself. You know, and just say, okay, is this a good idea? After, you know, take all these big fancy words away. Do I have an idea under all of that? And if you do, then I should be able to understand it. I'm not a sociologist, but I'm an educated person. I read an awful lot, you know, and I should be able to understand what you're saying. And if I don't, maybe I'm not smart enough, or maybe, you know, there's not something down in there. But I guess that would.
It's hard to follow up on that. I was really compelled by your juxtaposing Daisy's manicured exterior and the thought with which she really took care in presenting a certain sense of self to the outside world, and then juxtaposing it with the house. And now I understand why you said a house has to be a character at the beginning. And so I wondered whether you could explain the juxtaposition, and was it a calculated one in the sense that she understood that she was going to garner favors from the outside world by presenting the perfect nail color, the perfect designer suits, and was it also a family mobility strategy in some way, in that she is also thinking that her sons will be treated more favorably in institutions by presenting this
Most definitely, and actually you reminded me that I didn't answer Ben's second question, which is this politics and respectability issue, right? And my mother was the expert at the politics and respectability. When she walked into Saks Fifth Avenue, you would have thought she lived on Park Avenue. I mean, her nails were perfect, her hair was perfect, her makeup was perfect. She'd have a Bergdorf Goodman bag that she just, you know, she rolled like wealthy people in New York roll. And we were dressed like that as kids. You know, as my brother George in a snowsuit. You know, we hated those suits, and you know, I had a cashmere suit probably when I was 3 or 4. I remember that getting dressed up in this little cashmere suit. One of my close friends, John O'Hara, is sitting there. He remembers my Kiana shirts from Saks Fifth Avenue that I wore to high school. So Mom wanted me to dress. I walked in. I had better clothes than some of my rich friends, literally. And it was kind of ironic, but that was the way to signify that we were okay. That we had, as my mother said, never have to ask anybody. But the politics of respectability is also what made the book so hard, because I was doing exactly what Mom would never want me to do, which is reveal all the backstage stuff. The backstage is not what you see. You see the front stage. That's why she doesn't go outside without full face on. You know, you never saw Mom without a face. And so that was the way she thought about herself. My face, you know, it's not on yet. You know, I mean, it's her turn, not my turn. And the notion that things in the household were not supposed to be talked about outside, the notion that we had very kind of, Victorian manners, you said thank you and please and for everything, no elbows on the table and, no yawning at the table. We had very strict rules, and in fact, when I first met Syma, whose Jewish family is much more expressive at the table, and it was very disconcerting for me because it was the very things that my parents said never do at the table. Right? And so it was hard, and they saw me as very stodgy and, and so that kind of Anglo, you're supposed to maintain a certain way. I think I was happy because of the 70s when all the kids started wearing ripped jeans and t-shirts, and suddenly I could dress like them, and my mother hated it. She wanted me in chinos and a polo, right? But no, that wasn't cool in '74, so I could grow a fro and wear the clothes the other kids had. So, and in fact, I still this is kind of dressed up for me. Like if you see me in Davis, I have cargos, sneakers, and a t-shirt on. And part of that is also about race, because I started realizing people treat me nice when I'm dressed up. Well, you know what? I want to be treated nice when I'm just a regular guy. And so I decided that I stopped dressing up precisely. It was like this weird kind of inversion of the politics of respectability. I'm going to demand I get a cab no matter how I'm dressed. And if not, I'm going to let you know about it. Right? And so I kind of, that notion of entitlement, right? That notion that I am going to get it and kind of fuck you if you're not going to give it to me.
Next question.
Let me just follow up.
Oh, sorry, we're both going.
Okay. I wonder if it's not a disservice actually to the graduate students and maybe assistant professors to ask how to write like that. I mean, would this be well received at, would not at ASR, I don't think, at an academic journal. Maybe I'm wrong, but the point is the discipline has norms. Every profession has its vocabulary.
That's right.
And if you write for popular audience, that's not what professional sociologists do.
Originally, we wanted to take this commercial, because originally I thought the profession wouldn't care, but if we can make money, awesome, right? And so we went to commercial press, and that we made it to Dell's marketing people, and they said, no, we don't have a big enough market. But actually, it's memoirs, it's history, but we don't know what it is. And so then it was like, okay, we were back to the academic presses. And in fact, 2 seats down from you was my editor, Eric Schwartz, who I have to say took the chance with us. I said, hey, I've got this manuscript, and it's a little out of the ordinary. We're going to have chapter notes. It's going to be like real citations, but it's not going to mess up the narrative. And so it was a very unusual thing. And Eric was like, okay, we'll go for it. So I am really indebted to Eric for taking the chance with us in this piece, and happy it turned out, because maybe that means more chances will be taken in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I guess my question is a bit related to last two that were asked. But I guess for practice, I'm thinking about kind of this tension, whether like real or imagined, within academics about keeping yourself out of your work. And so it would I think, be disingenuous to say that we don't have personal stakes in the work that we decide to pursue, whether they be because of our background or our interest or what we care about. But then when it comes to actually producing that work, we have to remove ourselves from it, and there's a sense that you don't want to be conducting research, or that you can't be present in the work that you do. But that it's that personal stake that drives you to do the work in the first place. And I think it's that personal dimension, as this talk opened, that also drives your reader to have an investment in what's being said, and what makes your kind of writing or the work that you're doing come to life or have a resonance with your reader.
Well, thank you. But I have to give a tip of the hat to a lot of feminist scholars who moved in this direction early, but I don't think their work was recognized as scholarship, right? Because they're too the individual speaking from the first person.
Well, I think so. That's part of my question: is how do you think that? I don't know if like best practices or like your reflections or thoughts about how we can as academics to be writing that is hopefully kind of more like topical and read beyond smaller audiences? How can we insert ourselves into our work? And how did you like kind of manage integrating the kind of like data that you were working with, the historical data, the real data that you went and scavenged with kind of your own personal memories and stake in the writing that you were doing?
You know, my approach to sociology, I feel very lucky. I went to the Graduate Center in the late 80s, and I met an awful lot of scholars who came from an earlier generation of sociology. And the kinds of things they held up to me as good sociology, most of it didn't have a graph or a chart or any data. These were, things like, stigma or, the social system or, and they were rich sociological, theoretical texts that we don't write anymore, in part because we're not given the time to write anymore. And so, I'm just made full professor, but I started in 1995. I have a crazy career in terms of trajectory. It was a lucky career in a sense that most people might have gotten knocked out of the box at different times because they didn't produce the stuff fast enough. But I actually believe to do quality work, you need time. I have a second project that I've been working on since 1998 that will come out with NYU Press this spring. And it started as, Lynn Laughlin, great sociologist, said, start sociology where you are. Well, I found myself in New Haven in a synagogue, a black guy, in the 90s when people said blacks and Jews didn't get along. And suddenly I see black Jews in the synagogue. I'm like, who are they? And how am I going to fit into this context? So both personal and professional. So I started this project interviewing people, and it turned into a whole big thing. And so now I had this project was difficult precisely because it's not a norm. Sociologists, I sent essays to sociology journals. They rejected it. I got published by Jewish intellectual history journals. I thought I'm doing sociology. Why? Because I'm bringing sociological concepts into a discussion. But they're saying, well, where's your data? Sorry, we can't publish. Right, so I'm thinking this is what limits us professionally in some fundamental ways when we model ourselves after the hard sciences and say only, hard data that's sort of quantifiable is data. Whereas Lynn Laughlin told me, data is kind of everywhere. It's more about the systematic collecting of that data. And so this project on black Jews not only is qualitative, but I'm drawing on Jewish studies, I'm drawing on historians, I'm drawing on geographers, I'm drawing on theories of race, which gives me my sociological teeth, so to speak. But I'm also very eclectic. And you know what? The Soch editor rejected it at NYU. I'm being published under Jewish studies. But you know what? Howie Wynant blurred me. So you go figure it out. You know what I'm saying? Like, if a major sociology will blurb it, it's sociology, right? I thought. But, so, it's not, the profession, I feel, places us in a box, and then we try to get out of the box. And I feel we lose students to other disciplines because of it, cultural studies, women's studies, all over the place, because we are so driven by a kind of natural science model, and we're stuck.
So I was curious on your take on the structural factors that are sort of facilitating sort of the downward mobility of your family, but more of the black elite, right? And so part of it, you can sort of tell the story by looking at place like Harlem, where sort of black elite is sort of in this very heterogeneous sort of community, right? And because of that, because they're in this particular environment, they are at risk for downward mobility that other, let's say, white.
Kind of like America Tillo kind of.
Yeah, right? So the sort of, that white elite families would not be, right? But also, I'm thinking about the work of Maya Beasley and opting out. So it could be a story about vocation. And so certain occupational choices that sort of contribute to less stability, right? And so I'm thinking about your family's work or in social work, right? And so this has certain types of impacts on the income that's coming into your household, the ability to sort of maintain this house. But also this, what you sort of described and your choices within sociology to do certain types of work that's not necessarily rewarded, right? And so that has its own effect.
I felt I was pushed in that unusual direction. When I was a junior in college, studying sociology, we were studying business, and I realized I'm going to get kind of screwed in this situation. I need to find a way to get into business. So I started taking business management courses, preparing myself for the corporate world. We're up in Westchester, Manhattanville, so I have access to all the Fortune 500 companies. So I went out trying to get sales and marketing jobs, not sociology jobs. I said, I'm going to go into sales, marketing, get into business, go make some money, right? I couldn't get a job. They said, would you like to go into human resources? Would you like to go into personnel? Would you like, which were all dead-end jobs within this corporate structure. So it's sort of, I said, wow, if I want to have a middle class life, I guess I have to have a professional job. I have to be a lawyer, doctor, or something. And so, but actually I didn't know how I was going to do that. So it was kind of like this idea in the back of my head. But meanwhile, the only person that would hire me was the friend of a best friend of mine who were Jews, who ran the transportation kinds of companies that pick up the kids in all the east side schools and uptown. And so that's where I got a job, working as a dispatcher for school bus companies, for Supertrans, they're probably still around. And Supertrans is building a new office up in Yonkers, and he showed me where my cubicle was going to be. And he said, I'm going to do sales of used school buses. And I took stacks of catalogs home to learn about seatbelt laws. And this is, this wasn't what I thought I'd be doing after college, right? And literally, he wanted me to sell 800 buses at $50 a pop, right? So I'm like, boy, he's going to be rich way before I make anything, right? So I'm thinking this is like not a good picture. And it was right during that time I met a graduate student who actually happened to be at Columbia University in the, she was studying this weird sports psychology science stuff. I forget exactly her title, but she was getting her PhD here, and she was doing work for a guy named Jay Shulman, who was picking juries in New York City. And she said, oh, I'm doing these death penalty cases, I hate it, you should work for this guy Jay Shulman. And I'm like, school buses. Who's this guy Jay Shulman again? Right. So I went down and interviewed with Jay, and literally I had my resume with me, and he could care less. He threw it up on the desk, he asked me a bunch of questions. He said, okay, when can you start? Little did I know, Jay Shulman was a major sociologist of his day. He did triangulation way before anybody talked about triangulation. So in the 1980s, I was picking juries for high publicity cases in New York State. I worked in the Westmoreland case, I worked on insider trading cases, I worked on, patent infringement cases, and these were all like, the Lindened wine glasses, Weinsteins of the law world. And Jay basically became my first mentor. Jay Shulman also mentored two other sociologists, a guy named Fernandez and Earl Ricketts, both of whom went into think tanks. And he basically picked me and made me his next person he was going to mentor. And because of Jay Shulman, he transformed my entire trajectory. Because I didn't have the social networks my family had, we weren't going anywhere. We didn't have any friends in the corporate world that were going to say, hey, Bruce, come on, get a job. I had a corporate guy at PepsiCo, a black manager, tell me to my face, I know you can do the statistics, there's just reading statistical differences. But, I really can't hire you because, you're black, and if you fuck up, and, I'm the new black manager, and sorry. So those are my experiences.
So I think maybe this is probably a good time to take, unless you have a last question, and we can hang around and answer questions afterwards.
Any last question? I want to thank you. This was amazing. One of my favorite things we've done here.
Thanks so much for having me.
The books are circulating, but keep it if you want, and then give it to somebody else in the department. It's a model. It's like an intimate part of our history, but also a model of how to write. So,
Well, if you have one of those unusual texts, I encourage you.
oh yeah, but
Eric Schwartz is sitting in the room. There he is.
yeah. And you're doing readings around the city this week, right?
Yeah, we did CUNY yesterday.
Yeah.
And we're doing Manhattan College tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the only venues we have right now.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.